Alright, hello. I think that's working. Yep. Should be up and about. Is that on? Yeah, there it is. There we go. Alright. Alright, so today we're going to be covering the last 3 laws of the laws we have yet to cover. We've covered all the laws for the mortal factions. Now we're going to take a look at the 3 factions that are added with the demon factions. Starting off, we've got Slannesh. Lashes Celesh is a breath with 100% armor piercing. The issue I've had with it is it doesn't seem to do that much damage. Looking at it, it does seem to do very good damage, especially overcasting it goes up to 24 damage on each model, 100% armor piercing. When you compare that to like Nurgle's one, Stream of Corruption. At a base level it does 24 and it's way longer, and it's also 100% armor piercing. And for some reason the Law of Slannesh is a very short breath. As you can see there, it barely stretches along the lengthways of the unit. And honestly, it's not the best. It does do some pretty good damage over time, like if the enemy's blobbing up on top of each other, it's decent. But most of the time I find that it does not do nearly enough damage. Not to mention overcasting it puts up to 9 winds of magic. Not a great spell. Slannesh doesn't really have that much of an issue dealing with obviously blobs of infantry. And you'd sooner just take some chariots than try and focus on using the Lash of Slannesh. Acquiescence. This is your generic sort of debuff. This reduces the target's melee defense and speed. Overcasting it increases the speed effect. I think the overcast is an extra 2 winds of magic. Of course, Slannesh doesn't have troubles catching up to things. Usually you're using it for that melee defense debuff. Because if you can drop that melee defense, you're going to kill them way, way faster. And for 6 winds of magic is a decent enough buff. Reducing a target's melee defense is always quite helpful, especially when it comes to Slannesh, because they want to kill things as quickly as possible. And 25-second duration is long enough for you to kill something, usually as Slannesh. It's a pretty decent spell. There's not any reason why you wouldn't take it. It's good against all factions, it helps in melee a lot of the time, and it does trigger the Slannesh passive. Looking at the Slannesh passive quickly, it is quite a decent one. It increases map-wide melee attack by 12 and leadership by 4. So you do want to be trying to cast this as much as possible. It's quite similar to the greenskin one. This increases it by a full for 10 seconds, which is a fairly short period of time, but if you can get enough casts off, especially if you've got cheap spells like acquiescence, and you just keep using it over and over again, you're going to get some good melee attack buffs on all your units. Yeah, overcasting it is okay. Reducing Slannesh doesn't have a problem catching things because everything they have is like 100 speed. So you don't really need to reduce that much by half their speed, but if something you feel like might be getting away from you, just slow it down to this extent. Hysterical Frenzy. Now, this suffers the problem of a couple buffs that demons have access to, in that it rampages your unit. It does provide a nice 40 melee attack and armor piercing weapon damage, but it doesn't help if the thing you cast on rampages and it ends up attacking the things you don't want it to attack. Of course, it could just be in a mad melee and you don't care what it's fighting, but it does last a full 40 seconds, which most situations, if your unit's in melee, it's going to go into rampage, which means that you're going to lose control of that unit for 40 seconds. Most of the time, Slannesh is more of a hit and run faction, not just a throw into melee and keep there for 40 seconds. So this isn't going to see that much use. Against factions that you have no other choice but to fight just in blind melee, like Nergal or Khorne, then it's helpful. But against those factions that you want to be doing more hit and run and you're more cavalry and chariot focused, this is not a helpful spell. Pervain of Slannesh. This is a spell that's better on masses of infantry, which is another reason why it's not used all too much. It does trigger rampage, which is a key feature of it. Being able to trigger, you could just use the spell theoretically just on a lord that is like flying up in the sky, and if they're low enough on health, you can set them to rampage. The damage component is nice, but again, Slannesh doesn't have that much of an issue dealing with masses of infantry, and the fact that this spell is more orientated to dealing with infantry means that it's not that needed. But the rampage mechanic of it can be quite helpful if there's a unit that is low on health that is running away, or a sorcerer, a caster, or a lord that is like low on health and trying to get away. Use this rampage and it'll force them back into melee. 10 winds of magic to activate rampage on something is pretty okay. Overcasting it just increases the duration for 30 seconds, which you probably don't need that long to kill something at Slannesh. Slicing Shards is a really nice bombardment spell. As you can see, it does 100% armor-piercing damage, and it does a nice area of explosion. It's very similar in damage to like the Overcast variant, especially is similar to Tzeentch's just army ability. It does really, really good damage in an area. It's probably one of the best bombardment spells in the game, aside from like Bolts of Flaming Ruin, I think is the Law of Fire one. It is a very powerful area of effect spell. If anything is in this area that it lands on, it is going to probably kill the entire unit, if not a very good portion of it, because it just does so much damage. There's not many reasons why you wouldn't bring this. A lot of factions tend to blob up against Slannesh, or like stack on top of each other, so this is really the way to counteract that as much as possible. You definitely want to be bringing this like in the majority of cases, just to try and repel your enemy from doing all this blobbing up on top of each other. And for 12 Winter Magic at the base level, it's really, really quite affordable. Quite a decent spell. I'd recommend taking this one almost all the time, if not just all the time. Phantasmagoria. This is a net spell. We've talked about why Slannesh doesn't really need things to be netted down so much, but if you have enemies in a sticky situation and you don't want them to get out of it, you can trigger this and they can't move for a full 11 seconds. This does also decrease their leadership, and Slannesh triggers their army ability by killing enemy units that are routed. So obviously the idea that was in mind with this spell is you trigger this on some enemy units, they rout, but they're also netted, so you can just kill them where they stand, and then you fill up your army bar really quickly. 14 Winds of Magic for that is a little overpriced in my opinion. I mean, it doesn't see a lot of use. And it's only for 11 seconds, which isn't going to do much in the long run. Of course, if you overcast it, you get 22 seconds, which is a lot better, but it's also 22 Winds of Magic, which is really expensive. So most of the time, you don't need this, so unless your enemy is again blobbing up, but if they're blobbing up, you kind of want them to be able to separate, you kind of want them to run away so that you can pick them off one by one, instead of them staying in this like mass on top of each other. But it can definitely have its uses, especially against some of those factions that have the sticky, slipperier units that you can't quite get a hold of. Not a terrible spell, but more often than not, I think Acquiescence and Slicing Shards are the two you're taking most of the time. Lash of Slannesh, Hysterical Frenzy, and Pervain. Pervain has its uses with the Rampage, but Lash and Hysterical Frenzy I don't think see that much use. Honestly, I think Law of Slannesh is probably the weakest of the demonic laws. It's okay, it's pretty good, but it's just not as strong as the other two. Speaking of the other two that are strong, Law of Tzeentch consists of probably one of the most powerful spells in the game. Blue Fire of Tzeentch. Blue Fire of Tzeentch does quite decent damage for a magic missile. Its core of it is armor piercing. It also has a bit of an explosion effect to it. It also applies Warp Flame, which gives a weakness to fire and reduces the target's armor, so that more Blue Fires of Tzeentch would be even more effective. It only costs 5 Winter Magic, and overcasting it gives more armor piercing damage for 9 Winds of Magic, so it's only 4 Winds of Magic more, so you could overcast it. Most of the time you're just going to cast the generic version. One of the strengths that comes with this, of course, is sniping characters. It does some quite decent damage at each of those missiles, because it should be noted looking at it. Looking at the spell itself. Alright, the wrong law. This is per missile. Each of these missiles does this such damage, and it fires about 5 to 6 missiles, I think. Maybe actually a bit more than that, I think. And they are tracking as well, and they are quite fast. Most of the time your opponent is not going to be able to dodge these unless there's a tree in the way. With a pretty decent range of 175 meters, you can use this from pretty far away. As you can see on the preview image here, it does also do really good damage to infantry, because it has pretty good explosions and penetration. Honestly, it's a good spell that kills like pretty much everything. Lords is usually used as a character sniper, but you can also angle it so it goes through a unit of infantry or cavalry and it will do just as good damage. And it's also a cheap spell to trigger the casting effects, of which Tzeentch has many of. Tzeentch does have a couple things that can only activate when casting. Of course, the Tzeentch law itself applies 11% damage resistance to all things. It's only for 9 seconds, so it's not amazing, but it can be helpful if you're intending to be in melee more than often. And of course, Tzeentch, especially like Kairos, I think has an extra casting effect. Pretty sure he does. Yeah, he also has the Law of Death one, which increases recharge rate, as well as like Greater Arcane Conduit, and all these other bits. So Tzeentch, of course, being the magic faction, only amplifies how good their spells is. And Blue Fire of Tzeentch is already a really, really good spell. No reason to not really bring it, especially if we compare it to like Fireball in comparison, if we take a look at it here. And go down to Lore of Fire, which is of course the alternative magic missile for Tzeentch. Because they do get Lore of Fire in their Lord, or Hero even. Fireball does 500, of which only 30% is armor pierce. And it's moving a lot slower, and it's all tied up in one missile as well, which can be worse because if that missile misses, you're going to miss everything. It has got a longer range, but Lore of Zinch is, I feel, a lot more reliable, and for the number of missiles they fire, it ends up doing more damage than the Fireball does. I can't exactly, it's hard to tell exactly how many it fires. I think it's more than 6, and already more than 6 puts that as more damage than the Fireball does. So yeah, Blue Fire of Zinch is a very strong spell. You always take it, and just hands down you always take it on Tzeentch casters. Another really good spell is Pink Fire of Tzeentch. Even though this doesn't have any armor piercing damage, it does affect a very large amount of units. Like, it's got a really long radius, and it usually hits like all the models in the unit. It also applies Warp Flame, which then expands later on as affects like the Pink Fire moving forward. It's very quick. It's pretty much impossible to dodge. Overcasting it doubles the damage. And even though it's bad against armored units, Tzeentch has like flamers and stuff to deal with those. This is mainly for dealing with those masses of infantry, like peasant spearmen and other demon factions especially is what it's good against, because none of them have really any armor, apart from Khorne warriors, but of course you've got bloodletters to kill as well. And so Pink Fire just does quite a decent amount of damage. It's one that you don't bring always. There's some factions you don't want it against, especially the more armored ones, or if you think you're going to be fighting more armor, but it definitely has a pretty good breath effect, especially when you, oddly enough, comparing it to Lash of Slannesh. Even though Lash of Slannesh has like 100% armor piercing, because it does less damage and has a smaller area, I find that as long as you're using Pink Fire effectively, you're going to get more usage out of it a lot quicker. Treasonous Inch is an area of effect that reduces leadership by 16. It's a pretty okay spell. Overcasting it applies a melee attack effect as well, which is okay. Of course, you're probably trying to use this so that your enemy routes really quickly. The issue is that Tzeentch doesn't really have that many ways or any really benefit to having your opponent route. Like, sure, they run away so you can chase them down, but Tzeentch doesn't have that many chasing units. They don't have a hound unit. Like, the cheapest thing they could use is Furies, which aren't the best at running things down because they don't kill them very quickly. And they don't really have any cavalry besides Chaos Knights, and if using Chaos Knights to run stuff down, that's kind of a waste. Of course, it does have a 20-second duration of having the enemy run is always good. If you're using it against demons, they'll melt quicker. But most demons tend to stick around for the long haul anyway. So it's an okay spell. I'd say it's probably the weaker spell in Tzeentch's roster. Really, just most of the strength is relied into these two first spells. But it's an okay spell. If you think you're going to have some leadership shenanigans and you think you can affect it, but most of the time you want to be using your Winds of Magic on Blue Fire and Pink Fire. Gloom Magic is a spell that boosts your recharge rate in exchange for draining your opponent's recharge rate, which is quite interesting, having a spell that buffs how much magic you get. As a whole, this is an okay spell. It doesn't quite translate very well. You'd think this might like completely restore it, but especially later on when your recharge rate is really, really slow, most of the time you don't really need this. It has a very minor effect on your opponent to begin with, and it doesn't actually restore that much magic compared to like what your opponent is losing. Overcasting increases the duration, so you get more of it, but as a whole, in terms of, you're basically just spending Winds of Magic so that you can lose Winds of Magic, but then also have your opponent lose a little bit of Winds of Magic. And seeing as Tzeentch is the magic faction who relies on their magic the most, you don't really need this against other factions until like vampire counts come out. Maybe when vampire counts come out you see this a bit more, but as it stands, there's not that many factions that rely heavily on their magic, unlike Tzeentch. So in the mirror match you could see it a little bit, but that's about all I usually see this being used in. Tzeentch Firestorm is a little vortex. It sprouts out 3 little vortexes that move around and apply Warp Flame and have pretty good damage on them. It's basically a vortex spell, except for there's 3 of them. It's not an amazing vortex spell, but it's pretty alright. It's not fully armor piercing, so it doesn't quite overwrite Pink Flame. In most situations you'd rather just use Pink Flame, Pink Fire of Tzeentch. Because it's not all armor piercing, so it's not like you're getting any effect to do more damage to armor piercing things. But it's a vortex spell, all the same. It will do a lot more damage than Pink Fire will, but it is also a lot more expensive and more random and less consistent. So if your opponent is stacked together in a blob, or they've like boxed up, then they've probably lost already. But you know, this is a fun way of dealing with that quickly. Now overcasting it increases the armor piercing, so you've got a bit more armor piercing going on. But that's 20 winds of magic. Like if you look at where is it? Purple Sun. That's only 18 winds of magic, and that's 63% armor piercing. Now this one does do a lot more damage, but usually the Purple Sun's enough to kill stuff. So Tzeentch Firestorm's an okay vortex, but it's nothing to write home about. Actually, another one to compare it to would be Flamestorm, which is just better. I think Flamestorm is just way better than this one. It's more focused, it does generally more damage, and it looks cooler as well. Like, it doesn't quite have the same effect that Tzeentch ones do. They're kind of like just little pillars. Infernal Gateway is fully armor piercing. This is a stationary vortex spell, so it sucks in just everything like Pit of Shades, but it's a really large area of effect, as you can see there. Now, 18 winds of magic is very expensive, but it is 100% armor piercing. Overcasting it increases it, doubles the damage, but also the cost goes up to 24 winds of magic. Again, if your opponent is blobbed on top of each other, this is a really nice spell. But most of the time, the consistency of Pink Fire and Blue Fire, that your opponent really can't do anything to dodge these, or like move out the way of these, or like minimize their effect. These will just always be really consistent, and the other ones really rely on your opponent messing up or not having full focus on their units, which most of the time you're going to want to go for the consistency, unless you expect to be fighting lots of new players. In that case, you probably should rethink your life choices. But as a whole, these two spells are like the ones you bring almost all the time. The other ones are more situational. These are just so consistent that it really makes Law of Zinch what it is today. Law of Nergal is our final law. Definitely splits out of being the other ones, being it has some healing, some nice debuffs, and its passive effect, which is a... Oh, why did I do that? I've suffered the consequences. I clicked too quickly. Oh well, I can talk about the Nergal passive while I'm loading in. So I'm pretty sure, just doing it off the top of my head, that the Nergal passive heals. It's the same as the Vampire Count's passive, except for it doesn't resurrect dead combatants. And it does do a bit more healing, I think. So it's a really good passive. It's the same reason why Law of Life is so good as a passive. Just being able to heal everything on the map for like a good percentage whenever you cast a spell. It encourages you to cast more spells, and also encourages you to lose more health, which is what Nurgle's really good at, because they have so much of it. It should also be noted that Nurgle heals are already way better than other people's, because now healing is percentage based, and Nurgle units have a lot of health. So you end up destroying a lot of health when you use any healing spells or abilities. Back we go. So starting off with Miasma of... Actually, let's take a look at that passive first to make sure I was right, because I'm pretty sure I was right, but I'll double check. Yeah, there it is. Just a heal per second. It affects all units. It's only for 5 seconds, so it's basically a 1% heal. But a 1% heal on all your units is still pretty good every time you cast a spell. Miasma of Pestilence is a debuff that reduces melee attack and charge bonus by 40%, and melee attack by 24%. Not by 40%, that'd be huge. Overcasting it makes it an area of effect as opposed to a single target. Like we talked about, the passive being as good as it is, and the fact that it's only 4 winds of magic, so you can spam the spell pretty reliably, it's fair enough to use. If you're reducing an opponent's melee attack against Nurgle units, you're probably not going to see them kill your units for another like 10 years. So it amplifies how slowly your units are going to die. And the charge bonus reduction is also quite nice, because kind of has some problems with cycle charging sometimes, or like just big heavy units rushing into the plague bearers. So as a whole, it's a pretty decent spell. Inoffensive. It's not exactly super consistent or super powerful. There are other spells you might want to take over it, but it's okay. Speaking of which, Stream of Corruption. This is probably the best breath spell in the game as it stands. It's really, really good. It's a long, thin, expanding tear shape, but if you angle it well enough, it can be just as good as like Pink Fire or Lash of Slannesh. It does more damage than Lash of Slannesh does, like double the damage that Lash of Slannesh does, for like 1 less winds of magic. It's still 100% armor piercing. It's pretty much unavoidable, just like Lash of Slannesh is. There's very unlikely your opponent can move out the way of it. It also applies poison, and I think it has a shorter cooldown than Lash of Slannesh does. Yeah, by 1 second. This is probably the best breath spell in the game. you almost always want to take this, unless you're fighting ogres, in which case there's not that much infantry for this to affect. Even then, it could do some pretty good damage. But as a whole, this is just a must-have in every. It's one of the reasons why you bring Law of Nurgle almost all the time. It's not Law of Death. It's just because how good the spell is. It's a lot of killing power for your units to hold something in place and then just melt it with Stream of Corruption. Just using this over and over again, even on the most elite infantry, it does just really consistent damage. It's really strong. And it's only 5 Winds of Magic, which again triggers your passive effect. Overcasting it does increase the armor piercing damage to a really big amount, like it doubles it. I don't know how that got through QA, but only 3 Winds of Magic and it doubles the already really good damage. Yeah, this does really good. Like 48 is like at least about half to 2/3 of a model's health usually. So that's going to take out about half of a unit in most cases. Assuming you're dealing with infantry most of the time, which most of the factions in the current meta are infantry focused, so you are going to be getting a good usage out of this. Also, Nurgle doesn't really have much AP, especially in their front line, so having this consistently armor piercing spell can really help with like Chaos Warriors of Khorne or Zargard or that sort of thing. Really good spell, always take it. Curse of the Leopard introduces this new melee damage reflection, as well as giving some armor to a unit for 7 Winds of Magic, lasting 18 seconds. Now, this effect really shines when you've got lots of models fighting even more models, so like you've got a unit of infantry that's surrounded by enemy infantry. And because how melee damage reflection works is when the model is hit by another model, the model that's hitting it takes damage back. And this can do some alright damage as well, but the issue is that it doesn't always work that well out, because like the best case scenario for this is having a unit of infantry surrounded by units of infantry, at which point you probably just want to kill them with Stream of Corruption. You probably don't need Curse of the Leper so much, because this does not reduce the damage that the unit's going to take, apart from the 30 armor, which is meh. This is just going to give that damage melee reflection, which I don't think it reduces damage. It just does damage back like a Thorns effect, instead of it being like a shield that reflects the damage completely. But even as a reflection thing, it's not quite that helpful. It's not very good on single entities because you only have like 5 models hitting it at a time. Monstrous infantry it can be okay against, so like some Chaos Spawn maybe. But as a whole, you usually want to use it on infantry against other infantry. Of course, if you use this on a single entity fighting a single entity, it basically doesn't do anything. It's an okay spell, but there are better spells in the Law of Nurgle, which is probably why it's a bit overshadowed and not brought very often. And it is, again, quite situational. You always want consistency over situationalness. Rancid Visitations. That's a nice one to sound. This is basically a much more expensive but also more powerful Spirit Leech. It does more damage, but it's also like double the cost. And like we talked about, with it being a good passive effect, this is going to use up a lot of your Winds of Magic. It does do decent damage to characters, because it's more like a Spirit Leech. Overcasting it increases the duration, so it lasts even longer, so it does even more damage. And it's a pretty good damage spell, especially when you're having problems with like certain single entities, like ones that are just flying around that you can't really touch. So it can be a pretty nice spell to use in certain situations, but again, it's situationalness, not consistency, which is part of the problem. And there are just better spells. Like Stream of Corruption, you'd want to use way more than Rancid Visitations, and Rancid Visitations is really expensive Winds of Magic wise. Expensive Winds of Magic spells, when you've got a good passive effect, don't really merge well together, so I wouldn't recommend bringing Visitations. It's probably the worst spell in the lore. It's not bad, it's just... I think Curse of the Leopard is actually probably the worst. Rancid Visitations is just a more powerful Spirit Leech. Blight Boil, I say more powerful, it's also more expensive. Blight Boil, this is a nice big central explosion effect. It is only 13 Winds of Magic, and it does do pretty good damage. But unlike Stream of Corruption, this is quite avoidable, or at least sort of avoidable. You can definitely see your opponent moving out the way of this sometimes, because it's a fairly obvious effect. And it does take a couple of seconds to wind up, as you can see from the animation. It does do good damage though, like 48 just on the base cast, which is, you know, the same as the overcast on this, so in terms of pricing, it's actually worse than Stream of Corruption. And the overcast does do 72 damage, which is enough to kill most models. And it is a pretty large area of effect explosion. It's more reliant on your opponent stacking things on top of each other for a more expensive spell, so most of the time you are just bringing Stream of Corruption. If Blight Boil was 100% armor piercing and Stream of Corruption wasn't, yeah, it might be different, but as it stands, this is just, you just bring Stream of Corruption more often, and it's better, generally speaking. Now, a spell that is very good in Nergal, because it's a healing spell. This is just good in any situation. We all know healing's a very good usage. This is 16 Winter Magic, so it is expensive, but it's worth it, because the healing you get out of it lasts 20 seconds, and you get 1.6% healing per that second, which adds up to around about 35% healing, which is pretty good. Actually, 32% healing, isn't it? Yeah, 32%. 32% healing, like a third of a unit's health, and that can be like about 3,000 when it comes to Nurgle units. That's pretty good for 16 Winter Magic, especially if it's on a unit that you don't want to die, or a unit that's in the thick of melee. It's a pretty good healing. It's like a healing spell. It's always good. It's a consistent thing as well, because your opponent is always going to damage your units, so you're always going to have a damaged unit. And Nurgle does have a lot of units at very high health, so this percentage-based healing does a lot more. There's also a pretty good range for a healing spell. 200 meters away is what your caster can be. Although, depending on what your lord is, most of the time you're actually going to be using it on your caster. Now, overcasting it increases that to the duration to what is it? What is it? It doesn't say on the number card, I think, does it? What does it say there? Oh, it makes it an area of effect one. That's the one. Instead of making it a single target, which is really good, but it's also 28 Winter Magic. This is literally going to use up all your Winter Magic in one spell, pretty much. That is a bit too much, although it is the equivalent of dropping like the Nurgle Army ability just on an area. And for that much healing, it's like casting Regrowth in an area of effect. It doesn't have the Vigor regeneration, which minimises the effect that much, but it's a really good heal. If you plan on death stacking for whatever reason as Nurgle, you can use this, and it'll be funny to watch all your units heal back to full, like seconds. So that is it for all of the laws, I believe. Let me just double check. Yeah, thankfully, I think they put all the first Game 3 ones. Oh look, they ordered it by Game 1 at the bottom, Game 2 in the middle, Game 3 at the top. So that is it for all the laws of magic. I'll find something new to do next week, as we'll have a few more bits to talk about. We've got all the Regiments of Renown to look at as well. Those are quite good. I'll have to talk about those, but I think they need a bit more testing before I make a decision on those. So thank you all for watching. I shall see you all again next week for something new. Goodbye.